Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give another minute to allow people to join in, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Lisa, I'm just going to flip my slide once just to make sure I've got the right buttons and it's all good. Okay, cool.
Sounds good, Julie. Thank you for being here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us as part of MOVA's Victim Rights Month webinar series. My name is Lisa McHugh. I'm the Director of External Engagement here at MOVA, and we're excited to be joined with Julie Youdovin for today's webinar presentation, What's Religion Got to Do with It? Talking with domestic abuse survivors and other crime survivors and victims about the role of spirituality, faith, and faith communities in their lives. Some helpful information before we get started. This is a webinar format, so attendees are not visible to the presenter or audience, and audio is not enabled. We are providing ASL interpretation and CART captioning for today's session. To view captions for this presentation, click on Show Captions at the bottom of your screen. And if you would like to view CART interpretation in a separate window, please check the CART stream link provided in the chat. You can use the Q&A function, not the chat, to submit questions or comments for the presenter. I'll be monitoring that function for you and be able to bring to Julie's attention if there's any comments or questions. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Julie Youdovin. Julie is the Outreach and Program Coordinator of Journey to Safety, the Jewish Family and Children's Service Response to Domestic and Dating Abuse. Before joining JF and CS in 2008, Julie spent over 10 years working at Safe House Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She has also held positions at the Union for Reform, Judaism's Religious Action Center, the American Jewish Community's Washington, D.C. office, and the American Arts Alliance, a nonprofit arts advocacy organization. We are very fortunate to have Julie here to uplift this very important topic. Faith, spirituality, or a person's connection to a religious community can sometimes feel uncomfortable or outside the scope of victim service work. And we are glad that Julie is here to provide us with information that can support survivor safety, support systems, and provide us information on how to break down barriers to assistance. And so, Julie, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Lisa, thank you so much. And really, thank you also. I wish I could see you. So thank you all so much for being here. And Lisa, thank you for letting folks know. I really can't see any of you. So if you do have questions or comments, Lisa just said this, I just want to underscore, please do use the Q&A function. If you're sitting there looking confused about something, I can't see your face. So please do engage as much as you can or as much as you want to by using Q&A. So I want to start really just by thanking all of you, not just for being here today, although that's a big part of the thank you, but for whatever brings you here, whatever the work is that you're doing, whatever brought you into this space. I know from working in a domestic abuse service providers organization, the work that you're all doing around victim services matters. It makes a huge difference in people's lives every day. You might not feel it every day, but it really does. And so for whatever brings you into this work, into this space today, into this conversation, I just really wanted to stop and acknowledge and honor that. And thank you so much for what you're doing in the next hour, but also for what you are doing with this big piece of your life. So thank you, and thank you. I also just want to say a word about taking care of yourselves. Hopefully in the work that you do, you hear a good amount about self-care and are very familiar with the concept. So just a reminder that any conversation about domestic abuse can be triggering, can be difficult, and particularly around religion and spirituality, since it's not talked about that much. If you find yourself coming away from this conversation with some strong feelings, with some strong reactions, maybe you were expecting to, maybe you weren't, I just really encourage you to reach out, call a friend or another trusted adult in your life, and you know, the stories that a lot of people are carrying are very, very heavy. And so we just encourage you to share this with somebody so that you're not carrying things alone. And so the pictures around this: remember to hydrate, remember to eat, breathe, the splashing in puddles. Actually, today may wind up being a splashing in puddles day. You know, go out, release some of the tension, and just take care of your spirits and your bodies in whatever way that feels like to you. And similarly, in this training, if you need to step away and come back, it's totally fine. First of all, I won't know. But, you know, if you need to step out for any reason, please do it, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself in this space, because that is job one. Okay, so as Lisa said, part of the reason that we're really lifting up this conversation is because talking about faith and religion and spirituality and all of those things can feel uncomfortable for a lot of different reasons. And we know that sometimes advocates and people who work in this field kind of have a church state mentality, right? We can ask all kinds of really intimate questions about somebody's life and what's happened to them and about the crimes that they're victims of. But then we hit this thing about religion, or about somebody says something about religion or God or spirituality, and sometimes we freeze. Like, we don't talk about that. We can talk about all this other stuff, but we don't talk about that. And so I was really excited when in conversations with Lisa and with MOVA staff that this was a topic of interest, because we don't talk about it a lot. And what that means is sometimes things that are really important to a person get missed. And it might be about supports, it might be about barriers, it might just be something about the impact of the crime on them, what happened. And if they get the sense that it's not okay to talk about this piece, it means that we can't do our work as completely and as sensitively as we would like to. And so that's part of why this conversation is really important. So before I even start talking, I want to point you to last week's webinar, which I hope you were able to attend. And if you weren't, just really encourage you to take a look at it when it is up on the MOVA YouTube site. So Amy Sellers-Bay came in and talked about this topic of culturally sensitive care for African-American Muslim survivors and African-American survivors. And so without rehashing everything that she talked about or went into, I just want to encourage you to go back to that webinar and watch that also. She talked about some very important things, and some of what I'm going to say echoes what she said or is connected with it. So please do go back and find that when it's available. Okay, so now we're going to get rolling to talk about faith and faith communities. So I'm going to separate these a little bit, and I'll explain why. So the idea of faith is really, when we talk about faith, we're generally talking about somebody's maybe connection with a higher power, with something larger than they are, a belief system maybe, a way that somebody might engage with their higher power. That belief and engagement kind of piece is really faith when we talk about faith. Faith communities are those places where people gather and come together, maybe to generally people of a shared faith come together in one faith community to pray together, to worship together, to celebrate together, to express a belief in God together, perhaps not. So these two things are obviously very, very closely related. But one of the things that often people don't realize is that they're also separate. They're two separate things. And that can be important, right? So sometimes we talk to people who are people of deep faith, and they're not connected with the faith community. And sometimes we think, oh, this person is a crime victim, And, we know that people often get very isolated after crime, or survivors of domestic abuse get really isolated. And this person is talking about their faith. They must want to be part of a faith community. And that would be a great way to end that isolation. And I would just say, hang on, remember to talk to the person. Is this what they're looking for? Is this what they want? Because sometimes people have become isolated and would very much like to connect with the faith community, but maybe they have been living with somebody who's prevented that, or who's interfered with their ability to connect with their faith community. But for some people, faith is private. It's a private expression. It's a private relationship with their higher power, and they don't want that community piece. So this is really just a word of caution. To a lot of this conversation that we're going to have today comes down to check in with the person and see where they're at before making some assumptions about what they want or need. So holding this idea that some people of faith may or may not want to be connected with the faith community if they are not already. At the same time, there are many people in various faith communities who are not necessarily there because of personal faith. There are plenty of atheists in our houses of worship, kind of across the board. And those folks may be going to that house of worship because they like the choir and they want to sing, or because they like the social justice work, or they like the people, or they like to study. They might like the cookies, at the social hour after the worship service. There's a lot of reasons that bring people into a faith community that have nothing to do with personal faith, right? So I realized after I had done this kind of presentation several times, I realized that those two things about faith and faith community were all jumbled together quite often. So typically it's fine to talk about them together, but just kind of call this out, highlight this idea that they're not the same thing, and that people find, connections to faith and connections to faith communities for different reasons and live their life that way in different ways. So I hope that makes sense. I will say here, I meant to say this at the very beginning. As we go, I'm just going to encourage you, as Lisa said, to use that Q&A. You don't have to have a question. It is also totally fine to just drop a reflection or a comment in, or say, this reminds me of something, or to connect some dots. So please use the Q&A to bring us into as much conversation as is possible. So as you don't hold all your questions till the end. We will take questions at the end, of course, but you don't have to sit on them. So if you have questions or want something clarified, or like I said, just want to make a comment, please feel free to use this as a way to engage with us as we do this. So I'm going to invite you, first of all, or next, just if you have any questions or comments about this faith community connection, please feel free to drop that into the Q&A. And the next slide is related. This is a related idea. So in our this is one of my newest slides. I had not been talking about this so much, and I realized that there's sometimes some confusion around all of these pieces. So I'm adding this in. So I hope this makes sense. Please let me know if you have questions here too. Usually, like out in the public sphere, when people talk about religion, they are usually talking about faith and faith communities, right? They're usually talking about people gathering in faith communities to worship together, to share religious beliefs, religious values, religious actions, things like that. That is what religion is. And that's generally how it's understood. This is what religious life looks like. And that's true in a lot of communities. None of that is wrong. That's absolutely true. But it misses something. So here's the thing. There are people who will identify as a member of a certain religion, but they're not talking about God, and they're not talking about worship. In some cases, as I said, they're atheists, or they're agnostic, or they probably believe in God, but they don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. But they connect with religious life, maybe because this civilization word isn't great. I'm still working on what should be in that circle. But this idea that they are part of a people, whether they were born into that people or they chose to just join those people, but they're part of a people that has a history, that has a story, that they're part of a chain of ancestors that go way back, right? And that's really how they connect. That's their connecting space, is through this idea of their history and their story. And other people connect through culture, right? holidays, and they don't celebrate holidays necessarily to worship or praise a higher power. They're celebrating a holiday, for reasons more connected with this idea of civilization. This is what you do. So there's, for example, in the tradition that I come from, there are Jewish people who probably haven't set foot in a synagogue in years and years and years, maybe never, except for like a family event or something. But they'll light candles at Hanukkah because that's what they do at Hanukkah. Or they'll observe Passover in a home ritual. So it's not because of a higher power. It's not necessarily because of worship. It's because they're connecting to this story, to this culture, to the civilization, and maybe this religion, right? So when we're talking about religion really, and we're talking about somebody's identity, it's often not about God and spirituality. It often is. And for many people, I don't mean these three circles are interconnected on purpose. And for those of you who actually use Venn diagrams the right way, I'm hoping I'm more or less on the right track with this. I'm not sure this is exactly correct for a real Venn diagram. But as you can see, these things intersect, they overlap, it's messy. There really aren't clear lines for a lot of people about which part of their religious identity is about culture and what's about prayer and what's about all of that. So what's important is to recognize is that if somebody says, I am this identity, I identify as this, all they've done is told you the label. All they've done is tell you how they identify, but they haven't told you anything about what that means to them, what they believe, what they value, if they practice anything, if they do anything around it. It is an identity, and it's an identity, and there's a lot of media messages, a lot of social messages that will say, if somebody says they are this identity, that means these things. And I'm going to encourage you to set that down, to just dismiss that and say, oh, this is how this person identifies themselves. Tell me more. What does that mean to you, right? We're gonna talk a lot about tell me more in this session, because it's very much about, what do all these things mean? And so this slide is really just sort of a cautionary slide about not making assumptions that if somebody says, I am this, and you hear a word that's a religion, that you immediately go straight to higher power, worship, prayer, things like that. It's an opportunity to learn more about the person, but not to make assumptions about who they are or what that means to them. Okay. Again, use the Q&A if you have questions or comments or thoughts. Welcome interaction. So to talk about these things, so we're going to get to the work of supporting people in a few minutes, but we're going to spend a little bit of time here on spiritual abuse and identifying spiritual abuse. So for those of you who have had any kind of domestic abuse training, whether it's a 1-hour workshop or whether it was the 40-hour training, can some folks drop into the Q&A just those types of abuse? You probably heard it on like the first day or in the first 15 minutes of an hour-long workshop. What are some types of abuse you can think of when you're thinking about domestic abuse? I'm going to flip to these glasses. Yes, thank you. Physical, financial, emotional abuse, absolutely. Lisa, I might need you. My chat is like part way off. Oh, there it is. Okay. Sexual abuse, thank you. Does spiritual abuse fall into the category of coercive control? Absolutely. So coercive control is this kind of very broad list of very broad category that are those things that aren't necessarily physical abuse. They can sometimes include that, but are just all of the things that are part of a system that somebody who's harming their partner sets up to gain and maintain control over them. So all the different ways that somebody might be controlling, and spiritual abuse is absolutely part of that pattern of coercive control. Thank you. Emotional abuse, absolutely. Thank you for contributing that. Am I missing anybody? So for some of you, hopefully, in some of the domestic abuse training you might have received, you might have also heard about identity abuse. And so spiritual abuse kind of hangs out in that bucket, hangs out in that neighborhood. Identity abuse is the way that somebody who's mistreating their partner might use anything about that person's identity against them. So in some cases, it's threatening to out somebody because of their sexual orientation, because of their gender identity. It could be making fun of somebody's accent. It could be saying to somebody, well, you went to school in a country that has a terrible educational system, so I'm smarter than you, so I should control all the money because you don't know what you're doing. Like using all kinds of things about who somebody is, how they move through the world. Some of the things around identity abuse are things that we're born into. Some of them are things we choose. Some of them are things we're born into. We're born into and then choose something different. These are all the things that make people who they are. And so these are all things that can be weaponized by somebody who's causing harm. So that's the list that we typically use when we're training about domestic abuse. So down here in this identity abuse, spiritual abuse, that's where we are. All of these different things that make somebody who they are. So thinking about that and thinking about spiritual abuse, I'm wondering if folks, again, can use the Q&A to drop in some thoughts about what might spiritual abuse look like in an intimate relationship. So what might one person do to harm their partner using spirituality, using religious belief, using connection with the faith community or connection with that religious identity? What might it look like? So please take a minute to use the chat to drop some thoughts in.
Julie, we have a thought here. Indoctrinating someone into a religion they didn't previously have.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I realized I hadn't scrolled all the way down. Lisa, thank you so much. And I apologize for the glasses changing. These are my read the chat glasses. So absolutely, that indoctrination is part of it. And along with that, twisting of scripture, right? Misquoting scripture or quoting scripture in a way that says, I get to make all of the decisions because I'm the head of the house, or because I know better, or because this is my religion that now I've indoctrinated you into, but I still understand it better than you do. Forcing submission is another really good example. Saying, again, I get to do this, I get to be in this position because our faith teaches that I'm in charge. And that I know better than you do. Also, their religion or place of worship. So saying this is the faith community we're going to be part of, or we're not going to be part of a faith community, and we're going to join this faith community. I know you're not comfortable in it, but too bad. This is the one we're joining, and this is how we're raising the children. So these are all. Thank you for coming up with some really, really good, strong examples of this. Oh, there's more too. Barring a partner from attending a church religious community, from attending church religious community meetings. Absolutely. Saying you can't go there. And, quite often, if you think about isolation and what somebody's trying to do to their partner, they may see that faith community as being a place where some of that isolation would get broken. So to interrupt or interfere with somebody's relationships in those spaces. A defendant telling the victim on a case that they shouldn't be on board to prosecute them because that isn't in line with forgiveness, God's will. Absolutely. That's a great example and very real. That you are going against what God teaches by using our legal system against me, right? That you are out of line there. So these are all, thank you so much. These are really, really solid examples of what this might look like. And so, switch your glasses again. Ta-da. So because control is at the center of abuse, and this is specific to working with survivors of domestic abuse, but I really do encourage you, as Lisa said at the beginning, to expand this to think about how it might impact, how a situation like this might impact any victim of crime, and what this might look like in terms of how they access the justice system, whether or not they get community support to access the justice system, what that looks like. So this, we're looking through this lens of controlling behavior, but sometimes it's a community response that's happening to somebody, not necessarily an intimate partner. But somebody might mock a person's beliefs or practices, or say like religions for children. This was, believing in God or in a higher power was okay when you were 5, but you're an adult now. Or, saying you don't understand this religion at all, like you don't know what you're doing, and I do. Disrespecting ritual or holiday items is another thing that we see sometimes. And if you think about where a ritual item or holiday item might come from, in some cases, it's something that a person buys because they really love it or because they need it for whatever the ritual is. But quite often these come from families, right? These come from grandparents, they come from ancestors. They often have been brought from other countries, other places in the world, and they provide this really tangible link, right, to history. And because religion is often tied up with family history and family practice. And, think about family Bibles, think about heirlooms that get passed from generation to generation. So that when somebody takes that item and either disrespects it or sells it or throws it out, in the cases of selling it or throwing it out, that means that the person whose item it was, whose family it came from, they don't have that anymore, right? They've lost the ability to hold this wine cup or to hold this ornament or to hold this prayer rug, whatever it is, to hold this thing that they've inherited from their family. And it's broken this really meaningful chain. So that spiritual abuse oftentimes has to do with these kind of very specific things, like this is what faith community we're going to belong to, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to be in the world. But it also digs deeper because it can also get to these things around, family connection. It can get to things about somebody's inner life, their spiritual life. It's a lot going on for folks. We talked about forcing or blocking faith community connection. Interfering with religious mourning practice is another one. So that could be preventing somebody from going to a funeral, from going to a wake. I know in the tradition I come from, in the Jewish community, there's a prayer that you say after somebody passes away for a certain period of time. And then you say it at the anniversary of their death every year. And tradition says you have to say that prayer with 9 other adults. In some cases, it's 9 other adult men. In other cases, it's nine adults. You're not supposed to say it alone. So interrupting somebody's ability to access a group of people to say that prayer with can be incredibly destructive, as can, preventing somebody from going to a funeral, to a wake, especially if it's a parent or somebody that they were close to. Interrupting religious practice or observance. There's plenty of things that are either supposed to happen on certain days or at certain times, and are pretty precise. And so saying on that day or that time or whatever, oh, we're not doing that, we have to go to the mall right now, or we have to go out, or we're going to play, or playing really loud, disruptive music when the person is trying to do that observance, that practice, that ritual, is another way that spiritual abuse can look. Misusing sacred texts. Somebody dropped that in the Q&A. It's another really important example. And resisting or refusing religious divorce. So there are some faiths where, in addition to getting a divorce in secular court, going through our civil justice system, you also have to work through a religious court to get that divorce. And as you can imagine, when there's abuse involved, it can be incredibly complicated. So these are just some examples of what this looks like. And to give you a sense, I'll just share a story from the work that I do from this is a number of years ago. We were working with a woman who was an observant Jew, which meant in part that when the Sabbath arrived on from sundown on Friday night till sundown on Saturday night, she did not turn on lights, she didn't use electricity, she didn't drive. She had a set of practices that she observed. And she had a kid who was probably 4 or 5 years old, a small child. And she had a boyfriend who would come over who was mistreating her. And the boyfriend would mess with all the lights, right? Right before sundown, he would go through the apartment and, turn some lights off and on. So what it meant was the bedroom lights would be on, the common space rooms would be off, and the sun had gone down. So they had welcomed the Sabbath, and her teaching, her understanding was that she couldn't touch the lights anymore. And so when it was bedtime, her child, who remember was kind of small, would start crying. And I think part of the reason he was crying is because his bedroom light was on and he was having a hard time falling asleep. And it was also, I think, because there was an adult in the house who was disrupting the laws of the Sabbath, and he didn't understand what that was or why a grown-up would do that. But in any case, what this person who was causing harm had managed to do was to wedge his partner into this space where she had to decide whether to turn off the light and comfort her child or follow the laws of God as she understood them. Those two things should never be in conflict with each other. And she was forced to make a choice between parenting and her belief system. That sometimes is what spiritual abuse is, and that's why it can cut so deep and be so incredibly destructive. Okay. So the next slide is just a reminder that emotional and verbal abuse go with everything, go with all the different types of abuse. And thinking back to a couple slides ago, that physical, emotional, financial, all of those different categories, they cross all, spiritual abuse crosses all of those lines. So we created, we talk about it as its own thing, but certainly forbidding somebody from donating to a faith community, not letting somebody, financially support a place. That, there's financial abuse, there's emotional abuse, not letting somebody go or restraining somebody. There's aspects of physical abuse. There's sometimes aspects of sexual abuse if it has to do with dress and modesty. So all of these lines kind of, there's not neat categories for these things. They all kind of inform each other and are interconnected in their own ways. We also want folks to know that abuse happens across faith communities, regardless of levels of observance, defined gender roles, or other differences. So sometimes when I work out in faith-based spaces, I hear not quite this literally, but I hear versions of a conversation that goes, oh, well, of course this happens in communities of faith because domestic abuse happens everywhere. It's that community over there that's doing it, right? So, and sometimes it's, saying, well, that community is very patriarchal and, the men have all the power. And so, of course, when you're talking about abuse in a faith-based community, you're talking about them. And in those communities, sometimes they'll say, well, we live by the laws of a higher power. We understand how to treat people. We understand kind of how this, how we're supposed to be living. We don't do that. It's those people over there that are in those faith-based communities where there's not strict adherence. They kind of do what they feel like doing. They don't get it, right? So even within faith-based spaces where everybody agrees, yes, this happens in faith communities, it is not uncommon for everybody to be pointing fingers at each other and at other people and saying, not us, them. And sometimes I get questions, or I get some pushback from folks who really are asking questions about patriarchal communities and saying, but women have no power in these communities. So doesn't it make sense that it would be, the rates would be higher there? And I think the way that I answer that question, it's a good question, it's a thoughtful question. The way that I think about it is it's not about the gender roles, it's about how power is used. And so in a community where there's strict gender roles, but there's an understanding that relationships should be built on trust and respect and safety, they're going to understand domestic abuse through that lens and support survivors. In communities of any kind of practice where that's not sort of the primary understanding, things slip through the cracks. So, for example, two of my favorite stories is one had to do with a pretty traditional rabbi who heard a story from a survivor who was in really a good amount of danger. And he told her that the tradition commands people to save their lives, to protect their lives. He gave her cover to leave her abusive partner, the partner who was mistreating her, because he said, this is about saving your life and protecting your life. And he understood that. And he came from a pretty, a community with some pretty tight gender roles, but he understood that point. Similarly, I know and also along those lines, we've had a couple people who came to us because they were connected to us by a group of nuns. And people are often surprised to hear that. But the nuns said to these two people that I can think of, and I think there were different sets of nuns, we can't do anything about the marriage, right? You are married. We don't have divorce. For whatever reason, annulment was complicated in those cases. But they said to the people, but this is not what God means for you, and this is not what God wants for you. And we want you to get help, and we want you to be safe. So you may be married to this man for the rest of your life, but you don't have to live with him, and you don't have to stay with him. That was an incredibly powerful message from some people would consider that a surprising source. I don't, but there are people who are definitely surprised to hear that and who make a lot of assumptions about what the religious teaching is based on what they know about that faith from movies, television, other people they know who practice the faith. Information comes from a lot of different places. I also know of cases, surprisingly, in the other direction, where a clergy person tried to intervene kind of with marital counseling or did some things that weren't so helpful. I know one story of a faith leader who said to a woman who was hospitalized, not for abuse, but as part of this process was coming to terms with her personal life, and who said, I can't do anything for you until you leave. And that closed the door on her because she wasn't able to talk to him anymore about it. And he didn't give her another option about how to think about getting help. So the moral of the story, the point of all this is just to say that we also encourage people to be careful about assumptions that they make about the messages that come from faith leaders. We have heard stories of people being told really awful, hard things by faith leaders that we really wish hadn't happened. And we also know stories of wonderful things that people have been told and supported and had connected with resources and helped. And it crosses all of those. I don't really love using the language of like conservative, liberal religions, conservative. I don't love that with religion, but religions that some people will make assumptions about how those faith leaders might think and talk about domestic abuse sometimes is very surprising. And all that tells me is that there's a lot of media and common wisdom kinds of stories that are wrong. So again, just being aware that abuse happens across faith communities, across denominations, and it really is how much a faith leader helps or causes some additional harm really has a lot to do with how they understand relationships and kind of what's going on, and also whether or not they understand abuse and they understand controlling behavior, and they understand that bringing two people together, if there's controlling behavior, is not, they can't broker that, they can't kind of do couples counseling or pastoral counseling until the person who's causing harm really is willing to change and is willing to embrace change. So for folks who don't understand that and try to make things better from a pastoral counseling level, that often doesn't work out so well. So I'm going to take a breath and just invite thoughts, comments, questions. Curious what you all are thinking about. If you're willing to share some thoughts or drop anything into the comment section, or it's the Q&A, I would, just checking in for anything. Okay. Well, keep them coming if you have questions as we go. So I'm going to talk about barriers and supports. And, I wanted to say and supports from the beginning, because when I started doing this work, everybody assumed I was coming in to talk about all the barriers around religion. And, people often have heard bad stories about faith leader comments and things like that. It's a mixed bag, as is, everything else. So I am wondering from all of you, if you can use the Q&A again, to drop in your thoughts about what might some people of faith be thinking about or concerned about when they consider reaching out for help or support. So what are those things? And it's really, there's a lot of things that people might be thinking about or concerned about, but I'm particularly thinking about what might people be concerned about revealing about that faith-based identity. what might they be thinking or wondering about and deciding whether or not they're going to share that? Are they going to talk about it? If they dress in a certain way, or what might they be concerned about? If it's clear that they're a member of a certain faith based on appearance or dress or anything, what might they be thinking about before they pick up the phone or start that email or text?
Really, one thing that comes to mind is whether or not the other person will understand.
Absolutely. And Lisa, when you say that, I'm just curious. Thank you so much for dropping your thoughts in too. When you say that, understand what? Like, what are you thinking about when you say understand?
Understand what their religion means to them, or understand their religion in general.
Absolutely. What assumptions might that person be making? Will they understand? Will they think differently about them if they know about that identity? For sure. Um, Switch over. Also, fear of being misunderstood or judged in the wrong way. Absolutely. I think you all probably, from the work that you do, understand that people who are crime victims are often judged all the time, right? They often experience a huge amount of judgment. What did they do wrong? Could they have avoided it? Could they have prevented it? Why were they there in the first place? All of those questions. And so this is one more thing on that list is will I be judged? Not necessarily, and that led to the crime, but just, am I going to be treated differently because of this identity? Yeah, thank you for that response.
I'm not sure if you see this, Julie. So we do have one more question, which is, will the provider compel me to abandon my religion?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it could be it could be that straightforward, or it could be sort of, well, do you really have to go there? Do you really have to be there? How important is this? Um, yeah, absolutely. That is a question. And related to that also, if you're dealing with somebody who is experiencing some financial abuse attached to the crime that, whatever the crimes are, um, sometimes it's even things like we have folks who won't pay private school tuition, and so some people say, "Oh, private school is a frill, is whatever." But for folks who have their kids in parochial schools in religious-based education for very deliberate reasons, it's not just a frill. It's about life. And, is somebody going to say, well, that's the least of your problems, without really saying, tell me more about what this school means to you and your child, or why that's important to you that your child is getting a faith-based education, and, sort of why this is important. So yes, absolutely. Pressure to separate yourself from some of your faith or your religious practice. Um, for people who eat with some dietary restrictions as part of their faith, things like shelter are a question, or moving into a community, like a farther away community where maybe some of the food you need is not going to be available, and your advocate doesn't understand that and is saying, yeah, but this will help you be safe, so like just eat something else for a while. If your understanding is that you do this because you are commanded to eat a certain way or live a certain way or do a certain set of things, and your advocate doesn't really get that, um, it just means that that kind of support is not going to feel like support. And Lisa, thank you for telling me that. I did not see that comment that didn't show up on my screen. So thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, and I'll just say we do have another interesting comment. Someone is saying generational trauma could cause them to be hesitant to reach out for help, or to mistrust in the agencies they are reaching out to.
Absolutely. I mean, generational trauma, things that are passed through generations. Let's try to find other words for it. Yes, that's an excellent point. And generational, connected with that generational trauma is generational experiences with systems, and with faith communities, that don't always create positive connection. So yeah, or being being categorized in a certain way or thought of in a certain way, and have that have been your experience as a child, your parents' experience, all of that. So thank you. That's a really important addition to the conversation. And Lisa, that also did not show up on my screen, so keep them coming. So people may be concerned about messages from their own community sometimes, and this isn't just religion. Sometimes it's a whole connection of things, but concern about engaging outside systems, right? So a police car in front of your house, what are, people, you're already identified with this identity. Now people are going to think this of us. So whether that's police car, it could be, what they're calling now a high conflict divorce, which in some cases is domestic abuse. It's not conflict. But having that kind of divorce out in open court. So sometimes there are messages from the person's own community that says, don't involve the police, don't involve the legal system, like just deal with it, or take it to our faith leader and let the faith leader adjudicate it and figure it out. Like, don't involve systems. So they might be concerned about doing anything that might be publicly recognized as stepping out of the community or as doing something that would make the community look bad. Whether it's, we have standards in this community, we don't want to appear that way. Or whether it's, look, people already think this is what's happening. If you go out and start talking about it, you're just building that stereotype. You're just making things worse for all of us. So there can be sometimes internal pressure, especially, and again, this has in some cases, this has to do with how certain communities are also treated by people who work in public systems or by people who are providers, who are very much susceptible to some of these stereotypes and biases that we're going to talk about in a minute. So there may be some pressure to not engage systems, or, and that could be a nonprofit. People don't always know the difference between public and the police and courts and private nonprofits. It's just all part of a big system for some folks. Fear of being judged is another, they may just be concerned about how you're going to think about this or how you're going to connect their faith to their experience, and that the worker or the person that they're telling or the advocate may connect those things, may say, oh, well, makes sense that they're coming from this community and I've heard that this is what happened. All of those kinds of things can be operative in somebody who's doing this work. So somebody who's thinking about picking up the phone might be worried about that. And then there's a stereotypes and biases piece, which is very real. I know a story from a woman that I sometimes train with who herself is Muslim, and she tells a story about a survivor who finally was trying to get out of she had gotten out of a relationship where she was being mistreated, and she was seeing a therapist to work on some healing and some kind of moving forward things. And she was Muslim and her husband was Muslim, or her ex-husband at that point was Muslim. And the therapist, after a few sessions, referred to her ex as a terrorist and his family as terrorists. And she hadn't said that, but he had filled in a blank there. He had taken a stereotype from the world and dropped it into her story, and dropped his own bias into her narrative. And I think without even realizing it, he just did it. She called him out on it, and she did not continue the therapy there. I also know a story from a person that I spoke with years ago who called a hotline in another state, talked about her story, included the fact that she was Jewish and her husband was Jewish in the story. And the hotline worker said to her, I think just said to her, oh, my mother told me that Jewish men don't do that. And the person hung up the phone and did not call another hotline for 5 years. And then when she saw that there was a Jewish program, she called our program. But these stereotypes and these biases are real. I don't know if any of you remember, can't tell generationally where we are out there in Cyberland. If you remember, Saturday Night Live used to have a character called Church Lady, you laughed at Church Lady because, she's kind of making fun of that. But if for somebody who's a regular church attendee, that kind of stereotype sticks. Are they going to be worried that they're going to call, and if they share that information with you, they're just going to be that church person? All of these stereotypes that you might be able to, if you stop and think about what stereotypes are of people of many, many different faiths, people who are those faiths are walking around with those stereotypes. They know you know them. And they may be worried that when they pick up the phone or they meet you in court or they come across you in whatever capacity you're working with, that all you're going to see is the stereotype of who they are. So that's just something. It doesn't mean that you need to do any. The part that's important for doing the work is really around that awareness and around our own, being aware of our own biases and what we are carrying about these assumptions about people, and what do we do with those, and how do we really make sure that people know that we're interested in seeing them as whole people. We're not seeing them as the list of identities that they might share with you, but that you see them as a person, and that your interest is in what does this mean to you and how does this impact you, and things like that, as opposed to you have told me these things about yourself. This is what I know about those identities, and so I'm going to go from there. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears, but I'll take a beat here also. Just to see if anybody has anything, questions, but also just like I said, connections, comments, things you're thinking about, things that are resonating for you, anything like that, feel free to drop in the Q&A. Okay. So we're going to go on to talk about that supports and barriers piece. So I'm wondering where you are and what you're thinking about, if you could drop in, I put both questions on the screen. I think we'll take them one at a time just so that we don't have Q&A chaos. What barriers, and just thinking about everything that we're talking about today, what barriers might faith or a faith community create for a person that could make it hard for that person to leave a partner? So what are some of the barriers that the faith community, spirituality, all the stuff we're talking about might make it hard for somebody to leave or even to reach out? And a lot of them, you don't have to be terribly creative or inventive. A lot of them are things we talked about in the spiritual abuse section. So it's totally fine to go back and remember what we talked about a few minutes ago.
Julie, one thing I would add is, fear of having the same response.
Yeah.
Negative response.
You mean from a faith leader?
Yeah, if they've experienced a negative response.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if I tell somebody, what's the faith leader going to say? What's that going to be like? And I'll say, especially if the faith leader is the person who married them, if the people are married or who did premarital counseling, because then it's, awkward. Like, well, I asked you to marry us a few months or years ago, but now I'm coming back to you and saying like, yeah, this happened. So that might be a barrier for sure.
There's a few things that have come in on loss of access to church or community. You have to forgive. You should try harder to make them not mad. Our scriptures say marriage can't be ended. You'll be isolated from this community. And fear of stigma associated with separation or divorce.
Absolutely. Thank you for those. Those are all really important points. Let me go. I think I found you. Some of this is coming up in chat and some of it is coming up in Q&A. So I think I got you all now. But yeah, let me just scroll down a little bit. Okay. Oh, and thank you for the person who added the accessibility note. So thank you for that too. On the stereotypes slide. So yeah, loss of access to church, right? Like, will they either kick you out or kind of unofficially shun you? Like, if word gets out that you are involved in this, will you wind up getting blamed and people distancing themselves from you, or in some cases, and that happens in just in ordinary divorce also. So with abuse, it's that much more. You have to forgive. Yes, some faith teachings are very connected to this concept of forgiveness. You should try harder to make this person not angry, right? You are doing something to cause the abuse is a response that somebody might be worried about, and it is a common response. This whole turn the other cheek, show gentleness, show kindness. When you're met with this kind of behavior, show this kind, gentle side, as opposed to, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Would you like to be connected with a domestic abuse advocate? Let's talk about your safety. Instead, sometimes it's more around these things around forgiveness and that marriage can't be ended. Idea of, you have to fix this. These are not your choices to be treated this way, but now somehow it's on you to fix it, which it might be in line with the teachings from that community. So that's an important and complicated piece. Okay. So some of the barriers that I'm thinking about, and I think you all have named a bunch of them, the tenets of the faith are opinions of the clergy. So that goes back to the teachings. Clergy and community reaction, fear of being marginalized or isolated. So you've all covered all of that. Family pressure sometimes. We worked with a family once that did not believe in divorce, and the whole family was living in a duplex, and the person who was being mistreated was living, I think, on the first or second floor with her husband, and family was on the other floor. And there was a restraining order, and the family kept unlocking the door and letting him in. And she could have she could have reported it as a restraining order violation. I'm assuming there's some court folks on who are like, wait, she had recourse. But when your own parents aren't supporting you, like, she could have reported, but then where was she going to go? Because they were supporting him, or they were supporting the marriage. From their perspective, they were supporting the marriage, not necessarily what he was doing. But they just said, you are married. That's it. Deal with it. And so family pressure can be powerful. Shame can, of course, be powerful, and it works in a lot of different ways for people. A sense of failure. If you think about marriage, we talk about failed marriages. If you're being mistreated in your marriage and you would like to get away from that, that doesn't mean it's a failed marriage. It means you're being mistreated by your partner, right? But we use this language. We use this language of failure. Stigma of being single in a faith community. I don't know how many of you are familiar with some of the, bulletins and newsletters, but they're often full of happy families, right? Couples sitting at tables or gathering in worship. There's not always a lot of lifting up of people who are single or in like a friend group with a bunch of people. And there are faith communities that it can be very hard to be single, especially if you're raising children. There might be a lot of questions about where the other parent is. Challenges presented by some sacred texts we have talked about, and stereotypes we talked about. So those are just some of the barriers. But let's talk about supports also. This is the happier part. Can you please either use Q&A or chat to drop in some thoughts about some supports that faith or a faith community might provide? There's nothing in our faith text that supports abuse, right? Your partner is misunderstanding the whole point of this text. And just because they say that they are the spiritual authority doesn't mean that they are. Your partner is. So that the clergy messaging and clergy reaction of saying, this is not okay. Like, I understand that your partner is saying this, but it's not okay. Intervention from faith leaders, absolutely. And generally, like I said, the intervention that's most effective most of the time is helping to connect somebody to support. It's not to sit down with the couple and try to adjudicate it or try to fix it or something like that. If somebody's causing harm and is not invested in change, in most cases, there's not that much a faith leader can do other than to refer that person to a program like Emerge or Common Purpose or other programs that work with people who are causing harm to change their idea about relationships and controlling behavior, and who work with folks to understand the relationships differently. And then maybe pastoral counseling may have a role later on. But until that abuse piece is dealt with, and so when there is clergy involvement, that's what we see as the most effective and most successful one, are the clergy who are much more focused on safety, on help, on assistance, rather than on trying to fix the issue. There are other thoughts on supports? I know it's easier to make the barriers list than the support list, which is, there's just something that's hard about doing this work. So shelter while victim gets settled. Yeah, some places can help figure out shelter. And thank you for that. I'm excited about that answer, because quite often we don't remember that faith communities are sometimes places where there's resources. So it may be that there is, a clergy fund that could pay for some nights of a hotel, or maybe the clergy has access to some kind of shelter program. There may be assistance for, getting your car out of being impounded so that you can keep going to work and get your kid to daycare. There may be discrete financial resources. There may be some shelter opportunities. There are also, for faith communities that have buildings, there may be a safe phone that the person who's causing harm may not. So for some people, for some survivors of abuse, if their partner has access to the phone bill and to, paying for the phone, they can go back and see all the calls, right? So they can see if that person is calling a domestic abuse program. But if there's a safe phone somewhere where the partner doesn't have access to those phone records, so a faith community may have a safe phone, might have a quiet office, might have a computer that a person could use to communicate or to look up some services that if they try to use any of their home devices, their partner is going to see, might go through their browser history, might see what's going on. So absolutely. Let me see if I can advance. There we go. So breaking isolation, those social supports are also important. Belief in a higher power for some people is incredibly helpful. It's a huge support to feel like you are drawing strength from somewhere to get through what you have to get through. Faith-based answers from leaders we talked about, or help from leaders. Family, sometimes when family knows what's happening, sometimes through a faith lens, family will get involved in helpful ways. And then these resource pieces. So these are all, it is important to understand abuse as, the supports of the faith community. I'm sorry, it's important to understand faith community, both through this lens of supports and barriers and kind of what's going on. And again, the way to understand that are those tell me more questions. How does this impact your life? What does this mean to you? It's not for you to kind of go out and do a whole bunch of homework and make another set of assumptions based on the homework you're doing, but is really to ask these questions. We also like to give folks a heads up that people who are experiencing harm or dealing with past harm of any kind, so any kind of crime victim, might sanitize their language. So they might tell one story to their clergy leader or to their, to whoever their faith leader is, and a different story to you or other advocates. And so sometimes, and I actually got this point from a friend of mine who is both a domestic abuse advocate and a minister. And she said the stories people tell her when she's in her minister role sound really different than the stories people tell her when she's in the advocate role. And what it means is you may be looking at something where you're like, I don't understand. The clergy person said that about that. And what the clergy person might have heard from the person is, well, my partner and I were fighting and, maybe there was a tussle. I'm not really sure what happened. And so then, and somehow, I don't know, I fell. And what the advocate heard is my partner called me these names, yelled at me in this way, and then pushed me down the stairs. And so from your perspective, if you're trying to sort this all out and you ever hit anything that's like kind of confusing, just be aware that it's possible that the different people's reactions are because they heard different versions of the story. It's not because the survivor at the center of the story did anything wrong or should have done anything differently. It's just people talk about things differently in their faith community than they do with their advocates, their workers, things like that. So just to be aware of that, if you're ever surprised by a clergy reaction, it may well be a reaction that merits a lot of surprise. We certainly see those. but it also may be because there's different stories, depending on the audience and the setting. Okay, so I'm going to move into, we're moving toward wrap up, but please, again, chat, Q&A if you have questions or thoughts. This slide is just in pretty much all my workshops, just supporting people, especially if you're not sure what to say. I believe you. It's not your fault. You're not alone. Help is available. These are all kind of just our key core messages. So these are not faith specific at all, but they're just some things to kind of have in your back pocket. And it's entirely possible if somebody's telling you a story and you say, I believe you, or you say it's not your fault, you may be the first person to say that to them. That can be incredibly impactful way to begin or end a conversation. And here's that tell me more language. So if you're wondering, so this is the thing when you're kind of thinking about, well, I have, biases and we're talking about this and we're talking about that. These are some of the questions that you might ask, or some of the way, if you want to know more about something, tell me more about what that means to you. Tell me more about what your involvement with this faith community or this faith means to you. How does this affect your decisions, your ability to make decisions? What are you thinking about when you're making decisions that has to do with your faith community or your faith? How does that impact your life? How is it helpful, not helpful? How does that make you feel? All of these questions are ways you're not there. Like when you are asking questions, you are not there to learn more about that faith, right? Your job in this moment is not to say, oh, I have my own walking expert about this faith. Like if you have those questions, go to Wikipedia. But if you're trying to sort of understand, okay, so you're telling me that you have this identity or this connection with this community, tell me more about that, right? And so here's the thing. Let me see if I can advance this. My slides I think they're getting tired. There we go. I'm going to go back to this for a second though. Because here's the thing. If you are thinking about your own biases and in the way that you might be thinking about stuff, it's really important to ask yourself, like, okay, this person has told me these things, and all of a sudden, maybe I've made a bunch of assumptions about them. And I'm telling you that because it's what our brains do, not because you're a bad worker or a bad advocate. You're not doing anything wrong. Our brains automatically, very helpfully, will fill in some blanks for us. And so I used to say, we provide services in this non-judgmental way. We don't judge. We are a non-judgmental program. We are open to everything. But the fact was, when I said that, it was meaning that I was not looking at my own biases. I was not looking at my own judgments that were happening while I was very busy saying we were non-judgmental. And the process is really about setting that aside, is really about stopping and saying, okay, this person just told me that they are part of this faith community or this faith. And I'm noticing all of the things my brain is doing right now to tell me who this person is. And I've got to identify that, set it down, and then ask these questions, some versions of these questions to learn more. So with all of that, and again, love to hear from you. So chat or Q&A if you have questions. With all of that, I'm also going to give you a word of caution. So if you're going to ask somebody about their faith, religion, or connection with a faith community, I'm also just going to caution you to be prepared for somebody to ask you about your faith, your religion, or your connection to a faith community. And I'm not giving you this caution so you don't ask. I'm not giving you this caution so you have a reason to not ask this question, but instead to be prepared for it, to be ready for this question. And I will tell you that I was training once, many, many years ago, a very, very early version of this training. And I was in front of a group that I thought were all social workers. I was not right about that. And I said, I was, trying to say, be prepared for this question. And I said, so if somebody asks you what your religion is, what would you say? Expecting a whole bunch of kind of social work answers about professional boundaries and what information you share and what you don't. And I got some of those answers, but I also got an answer. It was very interesting. This woman stood up and she said, well, if somebody asked me what my religion is, she said something along the lines of, I would tell them that I'm Christian. I go to church every Sunday. I go to prayer circle every Wednesday. I hear the good news and I'd be happy to share it with them and see if they want to help share it with other people. That was not an answer I was prepared for right there. It was a perfectly fine answer to the question that I had asked, but I wasn't ready for it. And so I would encourage you all to think about the first question to ask yourselves is, do I know what my employer's policy is about sharing personal information? If you don't know the answer to that, go learn it. Talk to your supervisor, talk to your team, because there are programs that will say no personal information. You just don't share that. We don't do that. You can't talk about it. And if that's the case, that's fine. Then you can rehearse one answer. You got one answer to this question and you're going to share it. If there's some wiggle room, sometimes you share it, sometimes not. It depends. Context means a lot. This comes up a lot for people who themselves are survivors of crime, of any kind of crime, and are doing work with crime victims. You know, when do you share your story? When don't you? What's appropriate? What's not appropriate? What's helpful and why? Depending on who they're working for and what the policies are there. What do you share and how and why? So I don't have an answer for you. I don't have a script. I don't have anything like that. And I'm not going to tell you you should or shouldn't share. That really is up to you as long as you're within your lane with your employer. Just the bottom line is be ready. Be ready for this question. Think about somebody asks you that, how would you respond? And kind of, practice it, talk it over with your boss, but be prepared to ask this question. So really, just to sum it up, to bring it together, this last piece is really about noticing our own biases. Noticing when somebody tells us they're a person of faith, where does that take our brain? What are we suddenly assuming? And if you're not assuming anything and you're wide open, awesome, you're doing it. But do that check-in. Do that check-in with yourself to see what you're bringing into the room. And what do you need to set down to be able to see this as a whole person? Multifaceted, complicated. Remember the stuff at the beginning of this webinar, which now seems like a long time ago, about how religion means different things to different people, and connections with religion and faith mean different things to different people. We don't know what it means to somebody until we ask them. And so that is a lot of the work of doing this work, is being open to it and available and okay, comfortable, or getting comfortable. You don't have to be fully comfortable, but getting comfortable having this conversation. So that's kind of the end of my piece. This is me and my contact information. And I think there might be our Journey to Safety program contact information either in the chat or coming in the chat. I also want to make sure everybody knows about SafeLink and about Jane Doe Inc.'s Find Help, so that if you are working with somebody and it's a person of faith and they, but if you're working with somebody and they want domestic abuse supports, whether they're a person of faith or not, you can call SafeLink to find out where their closest domestic abuse program is if they're not connected with an advocate, and if you're not. You can also put that information in at Jane Doe Find Help, just to make sure that you know where your resources are. Hopefully this is not news to anybody, but I put it in just in case. There are also a couple of Massachusetts-based resources that are faith-specific, including Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse. And Safe Havens is a national organization. They do clergy training. They work very specifically with clergy. They're an excellent resource. They have a lot of great stuff on their website. Highly recommend you check them out. Our program provides, part of what we do is provide some specialized support for Jewish survivors. Hagar's sister provides some specialized support for Christian survivors. I'll also tell you that ATASC and Saheli in our community in Massachusetts, I didn't put them on the list because they're not faith specific, but because they're culturally specific, they do have a lot of experience and work in different faith communities. And so they're also excellent resources. And finally, blame, shame, fear, control, and humiliation are not part of a healthy relationship, because love should be safe. So I'm happy to take more questions. And Lisa, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm just going to give it another minute for any questions that might come through. Especially while we have this time together.
Yeah, or just anything you're thinking about, or anything that you're going to take away that's helpful to you. And thank you for putting the information. Please make sure you see in the chat the additional support that's available to you as you do this work.
I love when the little hearts float up. It's a lot of
I know,
appreciation.
they're excellent.
Okay.
And also, my information is there. If you have any questions that you want to have more discussion on and you want to follow up, I welcome hearing from you directly.
Thank you for saying that, Julie.
Oh, thank you all. I'm going to totally use these reactions when I'm on webinars. Like, you don't realize, until you're in the hot seat, how awesome they are. So thank you. I'm going to definitely remember to use those to thank other people. Oh, thank you in the chat. Thank you so much.
So not seeing any questions coming through, but we'll still keep an eye out while we're closing out here. Just wanted to say, Julie, thank you for your important work and for highlighting the role that faith, spirituality, and faith communities may play in the lives of survivors of domestic abuse and other crimes. We appreciate you. Thank you also to the ASL and CART interpreters for supporting accessibility today, and thank you for all you do. And to everyone that's joined us, thank you for taking the time to be part of this webinar series and part of Victim Rights Month. We appreciate the providers, allies, and persons with lived experience for all that you do to uplift victim rights and services in the Commonwealth. You can join us next week as we continue the webinar series in honor of Victims' Rights Month. And seeing no questions, I'll just say on behalf of MOVA, thank you again for joining us today for this meaningful session.
Thank you all. Thank you, MOVA.
Of course. Take good care. Bye-bye.